6:30 in the evening on the 14th of May, 2026. The Persian Gulf was a flat sheet of hammered lead under a dying sun, reflecting a bruised purple sky. The air was thick with the suffocating humidity of early summer, carrying the sharp, metallic tang of jet fuel and the heavy, brine-soaked scent of salt spray from the churning wake of the massive ship. Aboard the USS Nimitz, the rhythm of flight operations was a practiced symphony of roar and steel. Sailors in colored jerseys moved with practiced efficiency across the 4.5 acres of the flight deck, their boots thudding against the non-skid surface. The heat from the jet exhausts shimmered in the air, distorting the horizon where the coast of Iran lay hidden behind a veil of haze. High above the carrier strike group, an E-2 Charlie Hawkeye circled at an altitude of 25,000 feet. Its massive rotating dome scanned the airspace for hundreds of miles in every direction. Inside the cramped, darkened fuselage of the radar plane, the mission controllers sat bathed in the blue light of their workstations. The tactical air controller noticed the first anomaly at exactly 6:32. It began as a flickering cluster of low-velocity returns near the Iranian port city of Bandar Abbas. Within seconds, the cluster expanded. It was not a flight of fighters or a single maritime patrol craft. It was a massive, blooming cloud of electronic signatures that seemed to crawl off the coastline and over the water. The technician adjusted the gain on the radar suite, his heart rate beginning to climb. The signature was unmistakable. It was a mass launch of low-cost, one-way attack munitions. The information was instantly data-linked down to the Combat Information Center of the USS Nimitz and the surrounding escorts of Carrier Strike Group 11. Below the flight deck of the carrier, in the nerve center of the ship, the atmosphere shifted from routine monitoring to the cold, focused tension of imminent combat. The commanding officer stood behind the consoles, his eyes fixed on the primary tactical display. The screen was filling with hundreds of small, red icons, each representing a potential threat. The reports began to flow in with military precision. The Iranian forces had launched a coordinated swarm of approximately 300 Delta Wing drones. These were small, slow-moving targets, but their sheer number presented a mathematical nightmare for any defensive system. They were flying at an altitude of only 50 meters above the water, hugging the waves to mask their approach against the clutter of the sea. The swarm was moving at a speed of 180 kilometers per hour, closing the distance to the carrier strike group with relentless mechanical purpose. At 6:35, the general quarters alarm began to wail throughout the massive hull of the USS Nimitz. The sound was a rhythmic, piercing gong that sent thousands of sailors into motion. Watertight doors were slammed shut and dogged down. Damage control teams donned their heavy spec fire-retardant suits, the fabric crinkling in the heat. In the hangars below, the air was filled with the frantic but orderly movement of men and machines. The elevators hissed as they brought more FA-18 fighters to the surface. The crew of the United States Navy knew the stakes. A drone swarm of this magnitude was designed to saturate defenses, to bleed the interceptors dry of ammunition, until the final wave could find a gap in the steel umbrella. On the horizon, the first faint hum of the incoming engines began to reach the outer pickets of the fleet. It was a low, buzzing drone, like the sound of 10,000 angry hornets. The sky to the northeast was no longer clear. A dark, jagged line had appeared just above the water, a mechanical plague of 300 units stretching across a front of 5 kilometers. The Iranian operators had timed the launch to coincide with the setting sun, forcing the American lookouts to squint against the glare of the orange horizon. The destroyer, DDG-51, the USS Arleigh Burke, was the first to take a tactical lead. Its ANSPY-6 radar locked onto the leading edge of the swarm. The ship leaned hard into a turn, its bow cutting through the swells as it positioned itself to shield the carrier. The commander of the strike group gave the order that changed the nature of the evening. The words were spoken calmly over the encrypted net, but they carried the weight of a regional war. Weapons free. The defense of the USS Nimitz had begun. and the first missiles were already warming in their vertical launch cells, ready to meet the coming storm. Exactly 7 in the evening, the last sliver of the sun had vanished beneath the horizon, leaving the Persian Gulf in a state of deceptive, velvet darkness. The temperature had dropped only slightly, but the air remained heavy and suffocating, tasting of copper, salt, and the oily exhaust of the carrier's catapults. On the bridge of the destroyer DDG-51, the green and blue glow of the tactical displays illuminated the disciplined, sweat-beaded faces of the bridge crew. The ship was slicing through the water at a steady 30 knots, its bow cutting, a towering white mustache of spray that glowed with a faint, ghostly bioluminescence in the dark water. Carrier Strike Group 11 had now fully transitioned into a concentrated defensive box formation. The USS Nimitz sat at the center, a massive citadel of steel, while its escorts pushed outward to create a multi-layered shield. The destroyer DDG-51 held the primary station on the threat axis, positioned 15 kilometers to the northeast of the carrier. The Aegis combat system, the brain of the ship's defense, had already prioritized the incoming targets. Of the 300 Iranian drones detected, the first wave of 80 units was now entering the engagement envelope of the ship's medium-range missiles. The commanding officer of the destroyer stood in the darkened Combat Information Center, his voice calm and steady over the internal net. He authorized the engagement of the lead elements. From the Mark 41 vertical launch system on the forward deck, the first evolved Sea Sparrow missile shrieked into the night sky. It was followed half a second later by another, then another, until 12 missiles were in the air simultaneously. Each launch was a violent hammer blow of sound that vibrated through the entire steel hull of the ship. The physical pressure of the launches was a heavy weight that could be felt in the chests of every sailor on deck. The missiles did not arc gracefully. They punched upward, on pillars of brilliant white-hot fire, their rocket motors roaring with a high-pitched scream that seemed to tear the very fabric of the humid air. The sky, which had been dark only moments before, was now crisscrossed with the jagged, smoky trails of American interceptors. The smell of burning solid rocket fuel, a sharp chemical stench like scorched rubber and ammonium wafted back over the superstructure, stinging the eyes of the stench-birding the stenchless stench-birdie. Lookouts. In the Combat Information Center, the technicians watched the blue streaks of the interceptors on their screens as they raced toward the thick cluster of red dots representing the drone swarm. At a range of 12 kilometers, the first evolved Sea Sparrow missile found its target. The proximity fuse in the nose of the missile detected the composite frame of an Iranian delta-wing drone and detonated its blast fragmentation warhead. A small, brilliant spark of orange light blossomed in the dark sky, followed instantly by several more. The lead element of the swarm began to disintegrate, shredded by thousands of metal fragments moving at 3 times the speed of sound. Debris from the destroyed drones, consisting of burning, plastic, and twisted wiring, tumbled into the black waters below. Despite the successful intercepts, the tactical reality was sobering. For every drone destroyed by a $1 million missile, more appeared on the radar. The destroyer DDG-51 was now a machine of pure logic and fire, its computers calculating intercept solutions in microseconds. The ship launched a second volley of 16 missiles. The deck once again wreathed in the blinding, flickering glare of rocket exhaust. The horizon was no longer a void. It was punctuated by the rhythmic flashes of mid-air explosions, each one a temporary sun that revealed the sheer density of the mechanical swarm still closing the distance. The defensive perimeter was holding, but the expenditure of ammunition was climbing rapidly. The crew of the destroyer worked with mechanical precision, their ears ringing from the constant thunder of the vertical launch cells. Carrier Strike Group 11 had drawn a line in the water, and they were defending it with everything the United States Navy could throw into the sky. 7:15 in the evening. While the sky above the Persian Gulf was being torn apart by the kinetic fury of the destroyer's missiles, a different kind of battle was being waged in the silent, pressurized compartments deep within the hull of the USS Nimitz. The electronic warfare module was a cramped room filled with the steady, high-pitched whine of cooling fans and the dry, metallic smell of ozone generated by thousands of high-voltage circuit boards. The air here was kept at a constant 68 degrees to protect the sensitive hardware, a stark contrast to the sweltering, humid nightmare on the flight deck. The electronic warfare technicians sat in high-backed chairs, their faces illuminated by the flickering blue and neon green light of the ANSLQ-32 electronic warfare suite. This system, known to the sailors as the Slick 32, was the primary defensive shield for the carrier against non-kinetic threats. The technicians were not looking through windows or radar scopes. They were looking at the invisible electromagnetic spectrum, where the Iranian drone swarm was broadcasting its location through a web of command and control signals. At 7:17, the senior electronic warfare officer gave the order to initiate soft kill measures. With a series of precise keystrokes, the ANSLQ-32 suite began to vomit massive amounts of electromagnetic noise into the air. This was not a physical weapon, but a wall of high-powered energy designed to drown out the signals the drones used for navigation and communication. The system targeted the specific frequencies used by the Iranian ground stations to guide the swarm, as well as the civilian-grade global positioning system frequencies the drones relied on to stay on course. The physical effects of the electronic attack were invisible to the naked eye, but the results on the tactical displays were immediate and dramatic. On the horizon, the disciplined, V-shaped formations of the drone swarm began to fracture. Without their command links, the drones were effectively blinded. The lead units, suddenly robbed of their GPS coordinates, began to wobble in the air. Their internal gyroscopes fought for stability, but the electronic noise was too great. One group of 15 drones, flying at an altitude of 40 meters, suddenly banked hard to the left. They collided with one another in mid-air, their composite wings shattering and sending showers of debris into the dark water. Another cluster simply lost its thrust as the interference caused their small gasoline engines to stutter and stall. They tumbled from the sky like dead birds, disappearing into the white-capped swells of the Gulf with small, insignificant splashes. Inside the electronic warfare module, the technicians watched the red icons on their screens begin to blink and disappear. The invisible wall of energy was shredding the swarm's cohesion, forcing the Iranian operators back on the coast to frantically switch frequencies in a desperate attempt to regain control. The air around the USS Nimitz was now thick with a chaotic mess of radio frequency interference, a digital fog that made it nearly impossible for any unauthorized signal to penetrate. The USS Nimitz itself seemed to hum with the power of the transmission. On the flight deck, sailors reported the smell of burnt air and the strange sensation of static electricity dancing on their skin. The massive antennas on the ship's island were glowing with the sheer intensity of the power being pumped through them. This was the silent defense of the United States Navy, a sophisticated high-technology shield that could kill an enemy without firing a single bullet. Despite the success of the electronic warfare suite, the swarm was simply too large to be neutralized by signal jamming alone. The Iranian operators had programmed a subset of the drones with autonomous flight paths that did not require a constant radio link. These units, nearly 100 in total, ignored the electronic noise and continued their relentless advance toward the carrier. They were the dumb drones, guided by simple internal clocks and pre-programmed headings, and they were now less than 10 kilometers from the hull of the USS Nimitz. The invisible battle was over, and the time for raw, close-range fire was rapidly approaching. 7:30 in the evening. On the flight deck of the USS Nimitz, the air was a thick, vibrating curtain of heat and noise. The last of the Ready Alert fighters, 4 FA-18 Gulf Growlers and 6 FA-18E Super Hornets were being hurled into the darkness by the steam-powered catapults. Each launch was a violent, mechanical punch that sent 30 tons of aircraft from a dead stop to 260 kilometers per hour in less than 3 seconds. The white steam from the catapult tracks drifted across the deck, smelling of hot grease and high-pressure water, briefly obscuring the yellow-shirted flight deck officers who moved like shadows in the dim red floodlights. High above the carrier, the air wing was establishing a combat air patrol. The pilots sat in cramped, high-tech cockpits, their faces illuminated by the green glow of the heads-up displays and the multicolored light of the touch-sensitive screens. The smell inside the cockpits was a mix of recycled oxygen and the faint, dusty scent of electronics. Outside, the night was a vast, black void, broken only by the blue-white flames of the jet afterburners and the distant, rhythmic flashes of the destroyer's missiles impacting the first wave of the swarm. The remaining 90 drones, the autonomous units that had ignored the electronic jamming, were now less than 8 kilometers from the carrier strike group. They were flying in a tight, low-altitude formation, just 20 meters above the minicky, white-capped swells of the Persian Gulf. The FA-18 fighters dived toward the water, their powerful AN/APG-79 active electronically, scanned array radars locking onto the small, composite targets. Because the drones were flying so low, the pilots had to be careful to avoid the clutter of the sea, where waves could mask the drone's signature. The lead pilot of the flight, a commander with over 2,000 flight hours, toggled his weapon select switch to the AIM-9X Sidewinder missile. This was a heat-seeking weapon designed to lock onto the small, hot exhaust of the drone's gasoline engines. In his helmet, the pilot heard the high-pitched, steady growl of the missile's seeker head as it found a target. He squeezed the trigger. With a sharp whoosh that the pilot felt more as a vibration through the airframe than a sound, the Sidewinder left the rail. The missile's rocket motor left a jagged trail of white light across the black water before it slammed into a drone 4 kilometers away. The result was a small, bright fireball that momentarily bleached the cockpit of the fighter white. But with 90 targets and only a limited number of missiles, the pilots quickly transitioned to their internal guns. The FA-18 was equipped with the M61A2 Vulcan cannon, a 6-barrel, rotary gun capable of firing 6,000 rounds per minute. The pilots dived on the swarm, the nose of their aircraft vibrating, as they unleashed bursts of 20mm high-explosive incendiary rounds. The sound of the cannon was a low-frequency, mechanical growl that echoed through the pilot's flight suit. In the night sky, the tracers looked like long, glowing fingers of orange light reaching out to touch the water. When the 20mm rounds hit the drones, the effect was devastating. The fragile composite wings were shredded instantly, and the small fuel tanks erupted in blossoms of orange fire. One by one, the red icons on the carrier's tactical screens began to wink out, but the sheer volume of the swarm meant that some units were inevitably slipping through the gaps. The pilots were working at the very edge of human and machine capability, pulling heavy G-forces as they banked and dove to line up their next shots. The heat in the cockpits rose as the pilots breathed heavily into their masks, their eyes scanning the darkness for the faint, blue-gray silhouettes of the incoming weapons. Despite the air wing's best efforts, the swarm was beginning to clue, fragment, and spread out, making it harder to track every individual unit. The outer layer of the shield had been effective, but the final, most dangerous phase of the engagement was about to begin. The drones were now within 5 kilometers of the USS Nimitz, entering the lethal range of the ship's own point defense weapons. 7:45 in the evening. The sky above the USS Nimitz was a chaotic tapestry of red tracers, white smoke trails, and the flickering orange glow of dying drones falling into the sea. The humidity had peaked, and a light mist was beginning to form over the water, catching the strobing lights of the defensive fire and creating a surreal, flickering atmosphere. On the bridge, the hum of the air conditioning was drowned out by the deep, structural vibration of the massive ship as it pushed through the swells at maximum tactical speed. The smell of ozone and the sharp, dry scent of burnt nitrate from the forward missile cells drifted through the ventilation system. Of the original 300 units launched from the Iranian coast, approximately 40 drones had survived, the outer interceptor screens, and the electronic warfare barrage. This remaining group was no longer a unified swarm, but a fragmented collection of low-flying shadows, hugging the surface of the water at an altitude of less than 15 meters. They were now within the 5-kilometer inner defense bubble of the carrier. At this range, the primary responsibility for the survival of the USS Nimitz shifted from the escorting destroyers to the ship's own point defense weapon systems. The tactical action officer in the Combat Information Center prioritized the threats based on their closing speed and bearing. He authorized the use of the rolling airframe missile system. On the starboard quarter of the carrier, the Mark 49 guided missile launching system rotated with a heavy, mechanical whine, its 21 individual cells slewing to track the incoming targets. The system was designed for this exact scenario: high-volume, high-precision defense against incoming missiles and small aircraft at extremely close range. One after another, 5 rolling airframe missiles shrieked from their canisters. Unlike the larger missiles fired by the destroyers, these were smaller and faster, leaving the rails with a sharp, dry crack that could be felt as a sudden pressure wave against the hull of the carrier. The missiles spiraled through the night air, their dual infrared and radio frequency seekers locked on to the heat signatures of the small gasoline engines. 3 kilometers out, 4 separate blossoms of white-hot fire erupted in a line as the missiles intercepted their targets. The drones disintegrated, their composite frames shattered by the expanding rings of tungsten pellets carried in the missile warheads. Despite the high kill rate of the rolling airframe missiles, the sheer volume of the threat continued to stress the system's cycle time. 6 drones, flying in a tight, staggered formation, managed to slip beneath the radar horizon of the primary tracking sensors by masking themselves against the wake of a nearby support vessel. They were now less than 2,000 meters from the hull of the USS Nimitz, moving at 60 meters per second. The air on the flight deck was thick with the smell of high pressure, steam, and the heat from the jet pipes of the returning fighters. But all eyes were now fixed on the dark horizon. The ship's last line of defense, the close-in weapon systems, began to wake up. The radar domes of the 3 systems mounted around the hull began to twitch, searching for the final 6 intruders. These weapons were the fire curtains of the ship, 6-barreled rotary cannons capable of filling the air with a wall of metal. The mechanical hum of the ammunition feed systems began to vibrate through the deck plating, a low-frequency growl that signaled the final, most desperate phase of the engagement. The crew of the USS Nimitz braced themselves as the drones entered the lethal range of the 20mm guns. 8 in the evening. The humid night air was suddenly ripped apart by a sound like a giant mechanical chainsaw. The portside close-in weapon system, a 20mm rotary cannon, had achieved a hard lock on the final 6 drones. The white radar dome atop the weapon system twitched with predatory speed, tracking targets moving at 50 meters per second. The smell of the flight deck, burnt rubber and salt was instantly overwhelmed by the acrid, choking stench of cordite as the weapon opened fire. The trigger was squeezed. The 6-barreled gun shrieked as it unleashed a stream of tungsten armor-piercing rounds at a rate of 75 shots every second. A solid beam of orange tracer fire reached out from the side of the USS Nimitz, slicing through the mist and the dark. The vibration was so intense that it rattled the teeth of the sailors. In the hangar deck below, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that shook the very foundations of the massive ship. The muzzle flash was a continuous, blinding strobe of white light that turned the gray hull of the carrier into a flickering ghost in the darkness. The first drone in the stack did not simply fall, it ceased to exist. The 20mm rounds punched straight through the composite nose cone, shredding the internal flight computer and detonating the small fuel cell in a single, violent heartbeat. The drone erupted into 1,000 fragments of burning carbon fiber that were sent flying in every direction. 2 seconds later, the weapon slewed 5 degrees, to the right and found the second target. The stream of tungsten drove into the drone's engine block, severing the propeller and sending the main body of the weapon tumbling into the sea in a chaotic, flaming spiral. The third and fourth drones were intercepted in a single, continuous burst of fire. The close-in weapon system tracked the lead unit and then shifted to the wingman with a precision that was terrifying to behold. The heat blast. From the spent shell casings, thousands of them clattering onto the deck in a brass waterfall, washed across the nearby catwalks. The air was thick with the chemical bite of burning propellant and the smell of hot, oily metal. The fifth drone was hit, just 800 meters from the hull. The rounds blasted off the left wing, causing the drone to roll violently, before it slammed into the crest of a 3-meter swell. The impact triggered the warhead, and a pillar of white water and orange fire rose into the air, reaching as high as the flight deck. The shock wave of the detonation hit the side of the USS Nimitz like a physical blow, rattling the windows of the bridge and compressing the chests of the lookouts. As the close-in weapon system swung toward the final intruder, the mechanical rhythm changed. The deep growl of the gun was replaced by a hollow, metallic clank. The green status light on the operator's console in the Combat Information Center flickered and turned a steady, ominous red. The portside battery had exhausted its ready-use drum of 1,550 rounds. For the first time in the engagement, the air on the port side of the ship went silent, broken only by the fading whine of the gun's cooling fans. The sixth drone, unnoticed and untouched, was now only 400 meters away, a silent shadow racing toward the steel wall of the carrier. 8:10 in the evening. The silence on the port side of the USS Nimitz lasted for only a heartbeat, but it felt like an eternity. The final Iranian drone, a 3-meter-long shadow of composite and explosives, was now within 300 meters of the hull. It was flying at an altitude of only 10 meters, its small engines screaming at maximum revolutions, a sound like a high-pitched snarl, cutting through the humid night air. On the flight deck, the damage control teams and the brown shirt plane captains froze. For a fraction of a second, their eyes locked on the dark silhouette emerging from the mist. The trigger was effectively empty, but the drone was still coming. The starboard side close-in weapon system was masked by the massive superstructure of the island, unable to bring its guns to bear across the wide expanse of the flight deck. The sixth drone, guided by its pre-programmed coordinates, angled upward in a shallow climb, aiming for the junction where the flight deck met the hangar bay openings. The impact was sudden and violent. The drone's nose cone punched through the thin aluminum and steel plating of the gallery deck just below the flight deck level. The warhead, containing 20 kilograms of high-explosive fragmentation material, detonated instantly. The blast did not produce a cinematic fireball. Instead, it was a sharp, white-hot eruption that shattered the surrounding bulkheads. The turret of a nearby forklift was blown clear off its chassis, sent flying 20 meters across the deck, before it crushed a parked towing tractor. A massive hole, 4 meters in diameter, was torn into the side of the ship. The heat from the explosion was so intense that it instantly ignited the hydraulic fluid in the lines running along the overheads. A thick, roiling cloud of black, chemical smoke boiled out of the breach, smelling of burnt plastic, scorched copper, and the copper-like tang of vaporized metal. The shockwave of the detonation rippled through the steel, throwing 3 sailors off their feet and slamming them against the tie-down chains of a parked fighter. The Defender reacted instantly. The ship's internal mass casualty alarm began to pulse, a high-pitched, 2-tone electronic shriek that overrode all other communications. Damage Control Team 7, already in their silver fire-retardant suits, surged toward the breach. They did not hesitate. They dragged heavy hoses across the deck, the nozzles hissing as they began to bank the fire with high-expansion foam. The drone had successfully struck the target, but the USS Nimitz was a city of steel designed to absorb such blows. Despite the jagged hole and the fire now licking at the edges of the flight deck, the carrier continued its turn, its 4 massive bronze propellers pushing the ship at 30 knots. The smoke from the impact was caught by the wind and trailed behind the ship like a black funeral shroud. but the primary flight operations deck remained intact. The immediate aftermath was a scene of controlled chaos, the sound of shouting men, the hiss of foam, and the orange flicker of the fire reflecting off the oily surface of the sea. The swarm had found its mark, but the heart of the carrier strike group was still beating. 8:20 in the evening. The air around the portside breach was a suffocating wall of heat and chemical fog. The smell of burning JP-5 aviation fuel and the acrid, eye-stinging stench of melting wire insulation filled the passageways. On the flight deck, the wind whipped the black smoke into long, ragged streamers that blotted out the stars. The sky was no longer filled with the streaks of missiles, but with the eerie, flickering orange light of the fire reflected against the low-hanging mist. The deck beneath the sailors' boots shuddered with the continuous, rhythmic thrum of the ship's engines as the USS Nimitz maintained its heading, refusing to let the strike disrupt its momentum. Damage control teams, looking like silver phantoms in their illuminized proximity suits, moved into the heart of the smoke. They moved in a disciplined line, their heavy boots splashing through a mixture of seawater and white firefighting foam that covered the deck like a layer of artificial snow. The sound of the firefighting effort was a constant, high-pressure hiss of water cannons and the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the AFFF pumps located deep in the hull. The temperature near the impact site remained at nearly 500 degrees, the heat radiating through the thick gloves of the sailors, as they fought to contain the blaze before it could reach the primary ordnance elevators. Inside the smoke-filled gallery deck, the scene was one of jagged steel and wreckage. The drone's impact had severed a main fire main and several electrical trunks. Sparks showered down from the overhead, like a waterfall of white light, popping and hissing as they hit the wet deck. The damage control officer, his voice muffled by his breathing apparatus, directed his team to establish a fire boundary. They slammed heavy steel thermal blankets against the bulkheads, securing them with magnetic clamps to prevent the heat from warping the structural supports of the flight deck above. The logistics of the recovery began even as the fire was being smothered. In the hangar bay, aircraft handlers worked frantically to reshuffle the remaining air wing. Two FA-18 fighters, which had been taxiing toward the catapults when the drone hit, were redirected to the starboard side. The flight deck was a crowded, dangerous puzzle of moving steel and high-tension wires. Maintenance crews began clearing debris, using heavy-duty brooms and a small tractor to push pieces of the destroyed drone and the shattered forklift into the sea. Each piece of debris was a potential hazard for the jet engines of the returning aircraft. Despite the chaos, the medical teams were already at work. 4 sailors had been injured in the initial blast, suffering from shrapnel wounds and second-degree burns. They were stabilized on the deck by corpsmen who worked with calm, bloody hands under the dim red emergency lights. The casualties were then moved onto stretchers and carried toward the ship's primary medical facility, their silhouettes disappearing into the dark interior of the ship. By 8:40, the primary fire was declared under control. The thick, black smoke began to thin, replaced by a heavy, white steam as the water cannons cooled the glowing metal of the hull. The breach was a jagged, ugly scar on the side of the proud vessel, but the internal watertight doors had held. The USS Nimitz was wounded, but its combat capability remained at 95%. The crew, exhausted and covered in a mixture of soot, salt, and foam, stood their ground. The sound of the wind and the waves returned to the foreground, a reminder that the ocean was the only thing that remained unchanged by the violence of the last hour. 9 in the evening. The Persian Gulf had returned to a deceptive, heavy stillness, the water a black mirror reflecting the faint, cold light of the stars. The temperature remained a stifling 32 degrees, and the air was thick with the lingering, chemical smell of firefighting foam, and the sharp, metallic tang of cooling steel. The USS Nimitz continued its steady transit at 20 knots, a darkened mountain of iron moving through the night. The only visible sign of the battle was the jagged, blackened hole on the port side, where the orange glow of emergency work lights flickered as repair crews began the process of welding temporary shoring into place. Carrier Strike Group 11 remained at a high state of alert, but the immediate threat had vanished from the radar scopes. Of the original 300 Iranian drones, the final count was a testament to the brutal efficiency of American integrated air defense. 284 units had been destroyed in flight by a combination of Sea Sparrow missiles, FA-18 cannon fire, and the electronic warfare shield. 15 drones had succumbed to internal mechanical failure or sea clutter navigation errors. Only one had reached the skin of the carrier. Failure or sea clutter navigation errors. Only one had reached the skin of the carrier. The cost of the engagement was written in the quiet, focused exhaustion of the crew. 4 sailors were in the ship's surgical suite, being treated for shrapnel wounds and respiratory distress from the smoke. 1 forklift and a flight deck tractor were total losses, and a section of the gallery deck was a twisted graveyard of scorched aluminum and melted wiring. However, the flight deck remained operational. At 9:15, the first FA-18 Super Hornet of the Combat Air Patrol trapped on the number 3 wire, its tailhook sparking against the steel as it slammed home. The recovery of the air wing had begun. In the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was clinical and professional. Displays now showed only the friendly icons of the strike group and the distant, monitored movements of Iranian surface vessels hugging their own coastline. The commanding officer sat in his chair, a cold cup of coffee in his hand, as he reviewed the initial damage assessment. The United States Navy had absorbed a saturation attack of unprecedented scale. The Iranian forces had attempted to overwhelm the fleet with quantity, but the layers of the American shield, from the outer reaches of the Aegis radar to the final, desperate fire of the close-in weapon systems, had prevented a catastrophe. The logistics of the engagement were already being calculated for the next phase. The destroyer DDG-51 reported that it had expended nearly 40% of its vertical launch cells. The port-side close-in weapon system on the Nimitz was being manually reloaded by a team of 20 sailors who hoisted heavy ammunition cans in the humid darkness, their faces slick with sweat and grease. The supply ship of the strike group was already moving into position for an underway replenishment at dawn, preparing to transfer hundreds of tons of missiles and 20mm tungsten rounds. As the midnight watch took over, the USS Nimitz remained the centerpiece of American power in the region. The smoke had cleared, the fires were out, and the rhythm of the ship had returned to the steady, mechanical heartbeat of a city at war. There was no celebration on the deck, only the grim, silent work of professionals who knew the sun would rise again on the same dangerous waters. The engagement was over, but the campaign continued. The silence of the Gulf was not a sign of peace, but the quiet interval before the next horizon turned to fire. 9 in the evening. The Persian Gulf had returned to a deceptive, heavy stillness, the water a black mirror reflecting the faint, cold light of the stars. The temperature remained a stifling 32 degrees, and the air was thick with the lingering, chemical smell of firefighting foam and the sharp, metallic tang of cooling steel. The USS Nimitz continued its steady transit at 20 knots, a darkened mountain of iron moving through the night. The only visible sign of the battle was the jagged, blackened hole on the port side where the orange glow of emergency work lights flickered as repair crews began the process of welding temporary shoring into place. Carrier Strike Group 11 remained at a high state of alert, but the immediate threat had vanished from the radar scopes. Of the original 300 Iranian drones, the final count was a testament to the brutal efficiency of American integrated air defense. 284 units had been destroyed in flight by a combination of Sea Sparrow missiles, FA-18 cannon fire, and the electronic warfare shield. 15 drones had succumbed to internal mechanical failure or sea clutter navigation errors. Only one had reached the skin of the carrier. Failure or sea clutter navigation errors. Only one had reached the skin of the carrier. The cost of the engagement was written in the quiet, focused exhaustion of the crew. 4 sailors were in the ship's surgical suite, being treated for shrapnel wounds and respiratory distress from the smoke. One forklift and a flight deck tractor were total losses, and a section of the gallery deck was a twisted graveyard of scorched aluminum and melted wiring. However, the flight deck remained operational. At 9:15, the first FA-18 Super Hornet of the Combat Air Patrol trapped on the number 3 wire, its tailhook sparking against the steel as it slammed home. The recovery of the air wing had begun. In the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was clinical and professional. The tactical displays now showed only the friendly icons of the strike group and the distant, monitored movements of Iranian surface vessels hugging their own coastline. The commanding officer sat in his chair, a cold cup of coffee in his hand, as he reviewed the initial damage assessment. The United States Navy had absorbed a saturation attack of unprecedented scale. The Iranian forces had attempted to overwhelm the fleet with quantity, but the layers of the American shield, from the outer reaches of the Aegis radar to the final, desperate fire of the close-in weapon systems, had prevented a catastrophe. The logistics of the engagement were already being calculated for the next phase. The destroyer DDG-51 reported that it had expended nearly 40% of its vertical launch cells. The port-side close-in weapon system on the Nimitz was being manually reloaded by a team of 20 sailors, who hoisted heavy ammunition cans in the humid darkness, their faces slick with sweat and grease. The supply ship of the strike group was already moving into position for an underway replenishment at dawn, preparing to transfer hundreds of tons of missiles and 20mm tungsten rounds. As the midnight watch took over, the USS Nimitz remained the centerpiece of American power in the region. The smoke had cleared, the fires were out, and the rhythm of the ship had returned to the steady, mechanical heartbeat of a city at war. There was no celebration on the Purdy deck, only the grim, silent work of professionals who knew the sun would rise again on the same dangerous waters. The engagement was over, but the campaign continued. The silence of the Gulf was not a sign of peace, but the quiet interval before the next horizon turned to fire.